Okay, is that better? Thanks. All right. Well, the name is Westphal, and you can call me TC. And we're going to take a little detour through the central nervous system today. All right, so you can see here, central nervous system over here. It's made up of the brain and the spinal cord, which is continuous with it. And this is pretty much what I'm going to talk about this afternoon. But then we'll talk about the peripheral nervous system. And the only thing I will call to your attention at this point are the fact that we have both an efferent and an afferent division, and we have both efferent and afferent nerves. So afferent nerves are sensory nerves that are carrying information back into the central nervous system, both through the spinal cord and through the brain. The efferent is the motor side. Those are the nerves that go back out to the organs, our heart, our blood vessels, our visceral organs, our skeletal muscle, and so on. Okay. And in general, afferent nerves are carrying information to a nerve, and efferent is carrying it away from a nerve. Okay, so the central nervous system, as I just said, is made up of the brain and the spinal cord. It's absolutely necessary for the maintenance of homeostasis. That is you heard about that on the very first day of the class. That's the balance within the body, everything what needs to be regulated. And of course, we're going to talk an awful lot about the homeostasis of the autonomic nervous system. But the central nervous system is responsible for everything we perceive, everything we feel, everything we think. I mean, obviously, it's the master director of everything that goes on in our bodies. And it's contains about 100 billion neurons. Okay, so a neuron is the morphological and functional important part of the nervous system. And a neuron, will be given some examples, consist of dendrites, which are bringing information into a nerve, the soma, or the cell body, where protein synthesis and genetic activity takes place, and then one axon. An axon's going out, and it's the axon that is transmitting the information from one neuron to another neuron. And usually the dendrites in the soma are receiving information from some other neuron. And of course, where this takes place, you've already heard about, and that's in synapses. So you can see how many synapses there are in the brain. There's billions of them. This interaction between two nerve cells, and a nerve cell and a dendrite, and a nerve cell and a soma, because what the neuron does is receive information and elicits information, okay? Transmits it to another neuron. That's what's happening in the brain. What happens in the peripheral nervous system is the neuron elicits this information to an effector organ, like the heart or the blood vessels, and so on. The brain is only about 2% of our total body weight, really quite small. And what it weighs is about in most of us, about 3 to 3.5 pounds. That's the weight of the brain. It does receive about 50% of the total blood flow, because there's a lot of metabolic activity going on in the brain. But that's very small compared to, let's say, the heart or some of the other organs. So this is the central nervous system, and yes, it's responsible for everything we do. Now the brain, we're going to divide it into 4 units, 4 systems, and they're summarized on this slide for you. The first is the cerebrum. Okay, that's number 1. Number 2 is the diencephalon. And together, they're called the forebrain, but each is separate. 1, 2. The brainstem is number 3, And the brain stem consists of the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla. And then the fourth unit is the cerebellum. Okay, so those are the 4 units of the brain. Now, when you first look at the brain, if we just opened up our skull and revealed the brain, it would look like this on the right. Most of it is covered with the cerebrum, actually. And the cerebrum, we're going to see, is actually divided into 2 cerebral cortexes. Okay, 2 cerebral cortexes. And that's what you're seeing here with this diagram right here. And you can see there are little ridges and so on because the brain is really folded to great extent. And if you unfolded it, it would be about 4 times the material than you have in this form. The other thing you see here is the cerebellum. So that's all you would see when you first look at the surface of the brain. But of course, underneath these cerebellar cortexes, or the cerebral cortexes, you have a lot of other important systems and nuclei. And that's what would make up. So right here you see this would be the same thing as this. That's the cerebral cortex, or the cerebrum. And underneath that you have the diencephalon. And we're going to see that some of the important components of the diencephalon make up the thalamus and the hypothalamus. And we'll talk about that in a second. Okay, now, also in the brain, there are a bunch of cavities, 4 cavities. And in those cavities are cerebrospinal fluid. So really, the brain is sitting in cerebrospinal fluid. And of course, that's important for buttressing the brain whenever we move very quickly and so on. And those ventricles, which contain cerebrospinal fluid, which bathe the brain, are actually coming from the spinal cord. So here's the spinal cord right here. And this is the central canal that contains cerebrospinal fluid. Flows into the 4th ventricle. Okay, so the other structure you see right here, this is the cerebellum. And of course, this is all the cerebrum. Remember, it's divided into 2 cerebral cortexes. This 4th ventricle goes up through an aqueduct here, and the 3rd ventricle, and then the lateral ventricles. And the lateral ventricles, there's one on each side of these 2 hemispheres here. Okay, so that's an important part of the brain. And then it's important to realize that, okay, so the whole brain, first we have this bony unit called the skull. And then we got 3 layers of meninges, which consist of the pia mater, the arachnoid matter, and the dura mater, which are layers here between the actual brain itself and the skull. And of course, in there are also blood vessels in the meninges that are going to also carry information to and from the brain. Okay, so that's important. And then you also see, this is, of course, taking the brain and cutting it this way. You can see where the lateral ventricles are here, and these other ventricles. And then down here, here's the cerebellum. And here's the brain stem. And some of those other components that we just talked about. If we just took the top part of the brain, you'd see it here with the scalp and the bone of the skull, and then these 3 layers of meninges of dura mater and arachnoid matter and pia mater. And of course, through the middle of that goes the veins and the blood vessels. So those are just some anatomical earmarks. Okay, so here's what I said just a little while ago. We've got the 4 subdivisions. The first one is the cerebrum, okay? The second is diencephalon, and the word cephalon means brain, okay? In the old days, they used to talk about the methencephalon and the telencephalon and a whole bunch of different cephalons. Now we don't use those terms, but we still use the term diencephalon. And together that forms the forebrain. Here's the third unit, the brainstem, consisting of midbrain, pons, and medulla, and cerebellum, okay? So I think this is important for you to know, that there are these four components. These would be a fair question to ask you. All right, now here's the forebrain. Okay, so forebrain, we already said, it's the cerebrum and the diencephalon, okay? And the cerebrum is divided into two cerebral hemispheres, or cerebral cortexes, on either side. And there's a big body of nerves that communicates between these two sides. That's the corpus callosum. You see that in some of the diagrams. Okay, so those are the cerebral hemispheres. And then these next three are the diencephalon, the thalamus, the hypothalamus, and a system that we're going to talk about, which isn't a bunch of nuclei. It's really a series of axons and nerve cells all put together. It's important, and we'll say a few words about it. Okay, so again, this is the original structure that we showed. Also, the cerebrum is divided into four lobes, okay? Four lobes. They're called the parietal, the frontal, the parietal, the occipital, and the temporal. Okay, and this is by far the most complicated, it's the largest part of the brain, the cerebrum, and the cerebellar cortex. And in addition to that, it's the most complicated. And it's where learning takes place and a lot of other things that we'll talk about in a moment. We are not going into a lot of detail about these different parts of the brain. And people have studied this for many, many years, so they know exactly which part of these lobes is going to regulate the movement of my finger, or learning, or memory, or thinking, all those kind of things. But we were not going to go into that kind of detail. We just want to know the big, big picture here. Okay, so this is the underneath. Actually, it's a cross-section that shows you on the outside here, all of this you see here, all of that is a cerebral cortex, the right and left cerebral cortex. So all of that's the cerebrum, okay? And then down here we have the diencephalon. Okay, so you can see what they're doing here. This is where they've cut the slice right down the middle. And then they take this section, and we've blown it up here. And so this is the cerebellar cortex. And you can see there's two layers. There's a layer called the gray matter, and it consists of dendrites and soma and some axons. And then there's also the white matter, which normally is consisting only of axons, the white matter. The reason they call it the white matter is that around these axons, which go out from the cell body, there are myelin sheaths that cover it. And that's what gives the white appearance. So you can see that the cerebral cortex is layered into 6 layers. And this is true in most mammals. Most mammals do have 6 layers. And you see different cells in here. Here's a cell called the pyramidal cell. It's important because it's the major outflow neuron from the cerebral cortex. So it's going to send information from the cerebral cortex to other parts of the cortex and to other parts of the brain. We just divide these cells into pyramidal and non-pyramidal cells. Pyramidal being outflow neurons, and the non-pyramidal cells either being afferent nerves or intraneurons and so on. Okay, so here's we just mentioned cerebral hemisphere. The outer shell we call the cerebral cortex. It's predominantly gray matter, which means that we got lots of cell bodies there. And the inner shell is white matter, primarily myelinated fibers, overlying cell clusters of gray matter. And we also have some subcortical nuclei. Now, this is what a neuron would look like. You've probably already seen diagrams of it, but right here is a cell body, okay? And the thing in the middle there, that's the nucleus. So that's where genetic material and replication and all that kind of stuff and protein synthesis is taking place. These little outgrowths here are dendrites. Okay, and you can see there are multiple dendrites that come in to the actual soma here. And then this over on this side, this would be an example of an axon, okay? And of course, the information is being projected in this direction. So it's being received here, and then it's projecting out here. And then out here at the end of it, it's going to make a synapse with either a dendrite, or it's going to make a synapse with a soma, or maybe even another axon, and it's going to transmit information through a neurotransmitter, which you've already heard about, chemical neurotransmitter, and that's what's going to transmit the message. And then these little bumps here, 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 those are myelin. They are supporting the axon and giving it nutrition and so on. And then there are also glial cells, which are not neurons, but they support the neurons. There's lots and lots of glial cells in the brain, too. So basically, that's what we have on this diagram. Okay, that's kind of the anatomy. You know, I wouldn't expect you to know any more than that. So what do these cerebral cortex do? What do they do? They precipitate in perception, generation of skilled movements, all of our skilled movements, our ability to be able to write, to paint, to do all those kind of things. I guess if you were a dancer, to be able to go up on your toes and all that sort of thing. But look at, they're also very much, the cortex is also involved with reasoning, learning, and memory. Learning, memory, reasoning, all those kind of things. So it's very complicated. There are multiple neurons, and there's different parts of the brain that we could actually, different parts of the cerebral cortex that we could actually trace for each of these functions. Now, underneath the cerebral cortex are some subcortical nuclei. So they're still cortical, but they're underneath. And one of the most important are the basal ganglia. These are a series of nuclei of cell bodies which transmit information up to the cortex. And you can see they participate in coordination of skeletal muscle activity. The basal ganglia is the part of the brain that's damaged. In Parkinson's disease, there's neurodegeneration of some of the neurons. Those neurons happen to make dopamine, but it interferes with the ability to make movements, okay? Because the defect interferes with transmission back to the cortex. And it contains a lot of connecting fibers. Fibers coming from the cortex to the basal ganglia back to the cortex, or coming in from other parts of the brain. So this would all be cerebrum, okay? The cerebral hemispheres, including the cerebral cortex, and the subcortical nuclei, basal ganglia. I already mentioned this. These are the lobes. Okay. Now, the diencephalon, which, remember, together with the cerebrum, makes up the forebrain, consists of two very, very important structures. One's called the thalamus, and the other's hypothalamus. And we had them diagrammed here. So when we were looking through this particular diagram, all of this is cerebral cortex, okay? Right here is lateral ventricle. This is the corpus striatum. That's the nerves, bundles of nerves that connect the right with the left. Here's the lateral ventricles that are bathing the cortex. And then here's the thalamus right here, this structure here. And then right under the thalamus, actually at the bottom of the brain, the underside of the brain, is the hypothalamus right here. Bunch of very important nuclei. And you're going to see how important they are in a second. Now, that's only 1% of the weight of the brain is the hypothalamus, but you're going to see how important it is. And it's also going to connect here with the pituitary gland. So there's the hypothalamus and the thalamus, and then this loosely connected system, limbic system, all make part of the diencephalon, okay? Okay, so diencephalon, thalamus, hypothalamus, and limbic system. Okay, this is the thalamus. The most important thing to remember about the thalamus is that it is a synaptic relay station for sensory information. Everything that's coming into the brain up through the spinal cord and through the brain stem ultimately is going to get to the thalamus. And the thalamus is going to sort of decide what I'm going to do with this information, and then it projects it up to the cerebral cortex, okay, to one of those lobes where information is, things are going to happen. So this is really an important relay station. It is very much involved in skeletal muscle coordination, coordinating the movement of our skeletal muscle. And of course, it's very much involved in awareness. So your thalamus, there's lots of impulses going through your thalamus right now, sending information up to your cortex because you're aware of what's going on in this room right now, or at least most of you are. So this role in awareness. So that's the function of the thalamus. Now look at the hypothalamus. This little structure on the underside of the brain, in the diencephalon, look at all the important things that it regulates, okay? It regulates anterior pituitary function. So in other words, it sends neurons to the pituitary that are regulating the release of various hormones. Hormones are chemicals that are released from, these are neurohormones, released from neurons, get into the bloodstream and influence organs some distance away from where they're being released. But the hypothalamus is involved in water balance, how much we drink, the regulation of the autonomic nervous system, which is the ultimate regulator of our hearts, our blood vessels, all of the glands in our body, and so on. And we're going to be talking about that in great detail on Wednesday and Friday. The hypothalamus is involved in eating and drinking behavior, in reproductive system, it reinforces certain behaviors, but it's controlling these others. It generates and regulates circadian rhythm. We all have a circadian rhythm, usually a 24 plus hour rhythm where certain hormones are released and so on and so on. It regulates body temperature, and it participates in emotional behavior. So you can see the hypothalamus is, even though it's very small, it's made up of a lot of different nuclei that project widely to different parts of the brain. So it's a real key player in all of these organizations, the hypothalamus. Okay. And the limbic system isn't a structure. It's a series of pathways that are very much involved in learning, emotional experience, your mood, your affect. You could imagine how if you're depressed, probably there's some deficiency in the way your limbic system's working. And it also is involved in a wide variety of visceral and endocrine functions, this limbic system. But it's part of the diencephalon, okay? And that's why we're pointing it out. Now, there are other systems as well. This is a very important one. This is the one that's very much involved in substance abuse, that almost all of the drugs that we abuse or take or get addicted to, like morphine or nicotine or amphetamine or cocaine, all affect the system. And it's really where the biological substrate for dependence takes place. So it's a very, very key system too. And it's also involved. You can see it, most of these areas are in some way involved in learning, of course. Now, learning doesn't always mean just learning the material I'm presenting to you. It may be something your skeletal muscle is going to do that has to be learned. But certainly the limbic system is very much involved in emotion and emotional behavior. Okay, what about the cerebellum? Okay, the cerebellum is that structure. Let's go back and take a look at it. I'm going the wrong way. Okay, right here. See right here. You can always see it. And it's also here. And it's very, very much involved in balance and auditory information. It also consists of layers of cells, almost like the cerebral cortex. In fact, there is a cerebellar cortex. So there's a cerebral cortex and a cerebellar cortex that's made up of different layers of cells, some with axons and some with soma and so on. And it's an important center for coordinating movement. It will not initiate the movement, but it coordinates movement, and it controls posture and balance. So that if we have damage to the cerebellum, we're going to lose our balance, and we're not going to be able to balance ourselves even when we're standing up. And it's important for posture. And it's something that you train the cerebellum. For instance, the example I use is when you're playing golf. Okay, how many golfers do we have here? We only have one or two golfers, but you know what golf is, don't you? You get this little red ball or little white ball, and you swing a club and you hit the thing, and you're supposed to put it in a little hole. I mean, to some people it sounds very silly, okay? But when you're playing golf, you can't be thinking about all the things you're supposed to do when you swing that club. Then you're you're just not going to be able to do it. Okay, you got to stay still. You got to pull it back. Keep your left arm straight. You got to keep your head down. You got to swing, follow through on the whole thing. So what we do is we train our cerebellum for those movements, and what we do is repeat them. We practice them time and time again, so that when we have to go up and hit the ball, all we do is just, it's automatic. Okay, so that's learning done by the cerebellum, and if our cerebellum is not working properly, we're not able to do that. Must be a lot of other reasons why we can't do that, because the way you hit a golf ball and everything, it's very simple. I mean, you just swing and hit it, but it's very hard. It's very difficult to do. Okay, so it's that type of learning that cerebellum's involved in. Okay. And so that's also an important structure. And then we have the brainstem. Okay, so let's go back and show you where the brainstem was again. Okay, right here. You can see it's the brainstem. It's continuous with the spinal cord. Spinal cord comes into the medulla right here. And then there is the pons. And then there's the midbrain. So one of the most important things, actually, all the information that's passing between the spinal cord and the forebrain and the cerebellum is going to go through the brainstem. Okay, all the ascending information is going to go through this brainstem. okay? So it's got many different nuclei. So that information is going to come in. There's going to be a lot of relay stations in the brainstem, okay, which are going to receive information coming from our bodies, and they're going to decide what to do with it. Do we send this information to the cerebral cortex? Do we send it to the cerebellum? Do we send it back down the spinal cord? Okay? All of that's going to be decided by the brainstem. So all the fibers passing between spinal cord, forebrain, and cerebellum in both directions, okay? Ascending and descending are going to go through the brainstem. And it's going to take this information, integrate it, and do something with it. The brainstem also has a lot of centers that are regulating a lot of important functions. You can see them here. Cardiovascular, respiratory, swallowing, vomiting, eye movements, all kinds of reflexes. And we're going to see some good examples of that when we talk about the autonomic nervous system. So information, let's say my blood pressure falls, okay? So the body is designed that the body says the blood pressure should be at a certain level, a set point, okay? If it falls or it goes up, the body's going to do something to try to bring it right back to that set point. Okay, so it would send impulses up into the brainstem, into a place, a center called the nucleus tractus solitarius. It's a major relay station in the brainstem called the NTS. It stands for the nucleus tractus solitarius. You're going to know it as the NTS. It's such an important relay station is that all that cardiovascular information is coming in, respiratory information, information about food intake and about taste, even information that's going to come in there that's going to tell your bladder whether or not it should be working or not. So the control of micturition, which is voiding, okay? All of those have, in that particular center, inputs, okay, that are coming in from the peripheral nervous system. And then the NTS decides, do I send that information right back through a motor nerve, a descending nerve, or do I send it up? Is it more involved in emotion or learning or thinking, okay? So all of that is taking place here in the brainstem. Now, people like to talk about a vasomotor center or a cardiovascular center. Really, there are multiple centers in the brain. Many different parts of the brain can have an influence on this. The brainstem is just where that initial information is coming in. Now, the brainstem is also where most of the cell bodies are for the biogenic amines. Okay, things like dopamine, norepinephrine, epinephrine, serotonin. These are neurotransmitters where the major cell bodies for those neurotransmitters are in the brainstem, but they send axons all over the brain, okay? So they're a very small percent of the total number of neurons in the brain, but they influence almost everything, okay? Obviously sleeping and behaviors of all types, okay? And their cell bodies are right there in the brainstem, okay? And they ascend or descend. Ascending means they're going from the brainstem to the diencephalon, to the cerebellum, to the cortex, or they descend down into the spinal cord, or where the neurons are that are going to send information out through the autonomic nervous system. Okay, so the brainstem is pretty important as well in receiving all of this information and integrating it, okay? And that's probably the most important thing that we can talk about as far as that's concerned. And it's the medulla pons, or the actual anatomical structures. Okay, so the last structure we're going to talk about is the spinal cord itself. Okay, so here is the vertebral column. That's a bony item where the actual spinal, the spinal cord itself is right down through the middle. Okay, so the vertebral protects the neurons that are in the spinal cord. And the meat of the spinal cord is this butterfly here. See, it looks sort of like a butterfly. Okay, and this butterfly is made of gray matter. That means it's got a lot of soma and dendrites. And right here, through this unit here, this is the dorsal root, the dorsal horn, and that's where neuronal information is entering into the spinal cord. So the arrow is in this direction. Information's coming here. And there are actually ganglion cells that regulate these nerves. So these are, we'll talk more about them on Wednesday. These are bipolar nerves that they send one fiber out to the periphery, and the other is coming into the CNS. Okay, that information's coming from the periphery in this direction, and that enters here the dorsal, and then it gets into the spinal cord, and then it may be sending through a whole bunch of synapses and neurons information up to the larger parts of the brain, or it may descend. Can do both. The information coming out of the spinal cord from the central nervous system to the peripheries coming through the ventral horn. So that you can see the arrows coming in this direction. And you've got this entering the spinal cord all up and down the spinal cord itself. That can be seen on this slide. So this is the entire spinal cord. And you see all these little things coming out. Those are neuronal tracts, either coming in or going out, either dorsal root or ventral roots coming into the spinal cord. And then, of course, the spinal cord is divided into the cervical fraction, the thoracic fraction, the lumbar fraction, the sacral fraction, and the coccygeal nerve that's basically right down here. And all along here, we've got information through nerves coming into the spinal cord or going back out, okay? And that's where the nerves are going to go that go out to the skeletal muscle that regulate our muscle tone, or that are going to go out to the heart, or going to go out to the blood vessels, and so on. And so that's the spinal cord. And then you see it goes right into the brainstem. And then from the brainstem, those neurons go to diencephalon, to the cerebellum, or to the cerebral cortex, okay? And vice versa. Neurons come the other direction all the way down through. So that's kind of the anatomical and the functional makeup of the brain itself. And that's as far as we're going to go, because we would have to do a whole class on neuroanatomy and neurophysiology to really, but I just want you to know the big picture, those four structures. What are some of the components of those four structures? I would hope you would know. I would hope you would know a little bit about each one. For instance, the hypothalamus being involved in all those endocrine and autonomic effects and so on. And of course, the cerebral cortex being involved, the most complicated, the most integrated, involved in learning, behavior, thinking, all that kind of stuff. Okay. So that's all I want to cover for this afternoon. Are there any questions? So if you want to get in touch with me, I've left my email address